My girlfriend gave my gaming PC to her brother, so I filed a police report against her. They say you don't know the full measure of a person until they're tested. Looking back, I can see all the signs I missed. But at the time, I was just Ethan, a 30-year-old software engineer, pouring my heart into a passion that grounded me through long hours and the monotony of life. My gaming setup wasn't just a collection of expensive gadgets, it was a tangible reminder of my effort, discipline, and the countless nights spent coding through exhaustion to afford it. For over a year, I saved every spare cent to build my dream gaming PC. It was an $8,000 masterpiece, a sleek, custom-built tower with liquid cooling, RGB lighting that pulsed with a hypnotic rhythm, and the latest NVIDIA graphics card capable of rendering even the most demanding games in stunning clarity. The mechanical keyboard felt perfect under my fingers, each key press a satisfying click. The ultra-wide monitor, perched like a crown jewel, pulled me into immersive worlds where I could forget everything else. It wasn't just a hobby, it was my sanctuary. Alyssa, my girlfriend of 3 years, moved in 2 years ago. At 26, she had a magnetic charm and a way of making everyone around her feel like the center of her world. She'd always made it clear gaming wasn't her thing. It didn't bother me, we had separate interests, and that felt healthy. She'd joke about my setup, sometimes calling it the spaceship, and tease me about spending hours playing pretend. I brushed it off. Relationships are about compromise, right? Besides, Alyssa often told me she admired my dedication, even if she didn't understand it. But there were subtle cracks. Comments like, "You could have taken me on a vacation with that money," or "Imagine what you'd achieve if you put this energy into something real," began to sting more over time. I told myself it was harmless, that she didn't mean anything by it. Alyssa could be a little dismissive, sure, but she also brought a brightness to my life I hadn't known I needed. Last week, my boss sent me on a 3-day business trip, a short-notice ordeal that disrupted my routine. I'm not a fan of traveling, but work is work. When I finally stepped through the door of our apartment, all I wanted was to collapse on the couch and unwind. But something felt off. At first, I couldn't put my finger on it. Then, like a gut punch, it hit me. The desk where my gaming setup had stood was empty. For a moment, I thought I was imagining things. My sanctuary, my pride and joy, was gone. No tower, no monitor, no keyboard, no mouse. Just a dusty rectangle where my ultra-wide screen used to sit. My heart raced as panic overtook me. Had we been robbed? I dropped my bags and tore through the apartment, searching for any sign of a break-in. But the windows were locked. The door had been secure. Nothing else was missing. When I found Alyssa in the kitchen, she was scrolling through her phone, completely unbothered. I blurted out my fears, the words tumbling over each other in a frantic rush. Her response stopped me cold. "Oh, that. I gave it to Liam. It was his birthday yesterday." She said it so casually, as if she'd lent him a jacket instead of my $8,000 gaming rig. I couldn't speak. My brain struggled to process the enormity of what she'd just said. Liam was her 19-year-old brother. He'd flunked out of college last semester and spent most of his days lounging around, glued to his phone or binging Netflix. The idea of him owning something I'd poured so much into felt like a cruel joke. When I finally managed to stammer out a demand for an explanation, Alyssa's tone shifted. She sounded almost annoyed, as though I were overreacting. She told me Liam had been dreaming of a gaming PC but couldn't afford one. She'd seen how much he envied mine, so she decided to be generous and gift it to him. "You can always build another one," she said with a shrug, like she was talking about replacing a coffee maker. "What's yours is mine. We're practically married anyway." My chest tightened as she continued. She claimed it was for the good of our relationship, that my gaming had become a distraction and a sore spot between us. Giving it away was her solution, a way to eliminate the problem. The way she framed it, as if she were doing me a favor, made my blood boil. I couldn't respond. Words failed me. Alyssa stood there, perfectly composed, as if she'd just solved a minor inconvenience. I wanted to scream, to demand she get it back, but all I could do was sink onto the couch, my mind reeling. She took my silence as acceptance and walked away, leaving me alone with the empty space where my dream had once lived. Sitting on the couch, the weight of what had just happened finally sank in. My dream setup, the hours of effort, research, and sacrifice it represented, was gone, handed away like a trinket. The initial shock began to morph into something heavier, anger. I couldn't let this slide. I needed to confront Alyssa and get my PC back. When I found her in the living room, scrolling her phone like nothing had happened, the frustration spilled out. I demanded that she call Liam and arrange for the return of my setup immediately. Instead of the apology I was hoping for, Alyssa's face twisted into a look of disbelief and irritation. She accused me of being selfish and materialistic, asking how I could value a computer over her brother's happiness. Her words stung, but it was her tone, condescending, almost mocking, that lit a fire in me. She refused outright. According to her, taking back the PC would make her look awful to her family, and besides, she said, what's done is done. She kept deflecting, painting me as the bad guy for daring to care about my property. She claimed this was a test of my priorities, a chance to prove that I valued her and her family over some overpriced toy. Her words felt like a slap. It was clear she didn't understand, or didn't care, about what that PC meant to me. I'd been willing to compromise on so many things for her, but this wasn't just about gaming. It was about respect. Her casual dismissal of my feelings cut deeper than I could have anticipated. Still, I held on to a sliver of hope that this was just a misunderstanding, something that could be fixed. I decided to bypass her altogether and reach out to Liam directly. Maybe, just maybe, I could appeal to his sense of decency. But when I called him, his response was anything but reasonable. He laughed. Actually laughed. He told me, finders keepers, man. I could practically hear the smirk in his voice. When I pressed him, he upped the ante, claiming he'd be willing to return the PC, for $5,000. He justified it by saying that's what it was worth, and since it was now his, I had to buy it back. The audacity left me speechless. Here was a kid who'd never worked for anything in his life, trying to extort me for something I'd poured my blood, sweat, and tears into. The call ended with Liam telling me to lighten up and hanging up before I could respond. My hands were trembling with frustration by the time I put my phone down. As if things couldn't get worse, the cavalry arrived. Alyssa's family started bombarding me with messages and calls. Her mother led the charge, scolding me for being selfish and not understanding the importance of family. She insisted that it was my duty to contribute and that I should be honored to make Liam's birthday special. Her father chimed in, claiming I was lucky to have Alyssa and that my attitude was proof I didn't deserve her. The sheer audacity of their words was staggering. These were people who'd barely spoken to me before, suddenly acting like I was the villain in some grand moral narrative. No one asked for my side of the story. No one cared about how I felt. I was just the outsider, the obstacle to their familial bliss. Alyssa's stance remained firm. She dismissed my concerns, telling me to stop acting like a child and move on. She genuinely seemed to believe she'd done nothing wrong, that I was the one blowing things out of proportion. Her nonchalance, her refusal to even consider my perspective, made it painfully clear how little she valued me or my efforts. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. The betrayal wasn't just about the PC anymore. It was about trust. Respect. The foundation of our relationship had been shaken, and I couldn't see a way to rebuild it. I felt isolated, outnumbered, and deeply hurt. But as the hours dragged on, my frustration began to crystallize into resolve. The next morning, while Alyssa was at work, I started packing her things. It was a cold, methodical process. Every item I placed in a box felt like another step toward reclaiming control of my life. This wasn't the future I'd envisioned with her, but I couldn't ignore the reality of what our relationship had become. The person I thought I'd build a life with had turned into someone I barely recognized. When I finished, I stood in the doorway of my empty office, staring at the barren desk. The absence of my setup felt like a physical ache, a constant reminder of what I'd lost. But in that moment, it also symbolized something else: the end of my patience, the end of my willingness to be taken for granted. This wasn't just about a gaming PC. It was about standing up for myself, for what I deserved. The betrayal had already cut deep, but Liam's audacious demand for $5,000 was the final straw. If Alyssa and her family thought they could walk all over me, they were in for a rude awakening. I wasn't just going to sit back and let them get away with it. My first step was simple but necessary: documentation. I recorded another call with Liam that morning. He was as smug as ever, reiterating his stance with that same mocking tone. The recording captured everything, from his refusal to return the PC to his demand for payment. It was damning, and I knew it would hold up as evidence. Next, I dug out the receipts and serial numbers for every component of my setup. Thankfully, I'd kept meticulous records. Armed with this proof, I headed to the local police station. Filing the report was straightforward. I explained the situation in detail, providing the recordings and documentation. The officer I spoke with took it seriously, especially after hearing Liam's blatant extortion attempt. They assured me they'd follow up and advised me to keep any further interactions documented. For the first time in days, I felt a small flicker of control returning. When I returned home, Alyssa's belongings were still packed, neatly stacked by the door. She came home not long after, and the moment she walked in, her face shifted from casual indifference to shock. It was clear she hadn't expected me to take such decisive action. Before she could say a word, I told her about the police report and informed her that our relationship was over. Her reaction was a whirlwind of panic and deflection. First, she tried to guilt-trip me, claiming she had nowhere to go and accusing me of abandoning her. When that didn't work, she shifted to anger, calling me petty and vindictive. She insisted that I was overreacting, that it was just a computer, as if that justified her actions. Then came the bombshell. In a desperate bid to regain control of the situation, Alyssa admitted she'd told her family we were secretly engaged. My stomach dropped. She tried to frame it as a loving gesture, claiming she'd only lied to make her family happy and to strengthen our bond. But the implications hit me like a freight train. This wasn't just about the PC or Liam anymore. Alyssa had been fabricating stories about our relationship for months, using those lies to justify her behavior and manipulate everyone around her. It felt like the ground beneath me had shifted. Every interaction with her family, every accusation they'd thrown at me, now made sense. They weren't just acting entitled, they genuinely believed I was on the verge of becoming part of their family. Alyssa had weaponized that lie to paint herself as the caring fiancé and me as the villain. Once Alyssa left, I knew I had to take the next step. I composed an email to her family, laying everything out. I detailed her lies, from the fake engagement to the manipulation surrounding the PC. I attached the proof, the police report, the call recordings, and even screenshots of her dismissive texts. I was careful to remain factual, avoiding any emotional language that could undermine my credibility. When I hit send, I felt a grim satisfaction, knowing they would finally see the truth. It didn't take long for the fallout to begin. Alyssa's father showed up at my door that evening, flanked by two friends. They didn't look like they were there for a friendly chat. As soon as I opened the door, the threat started. They accused me of trying to ruin Alyssa's life, demanded I retract the police report, and implied there would be consequences if I didn't. But I'd anticipated this. My phone was already recording in my pocket. I let them vent, keeping my responses calm and measured. When they realized I wasn't backing down, their tone shifted from anger to frustration. I reminded them that any further threats could and would be added to the police report. That seemed to deflate their bravado. After a tense standoff, they left, muttering under their breath. As the door clicked shut, I felt a strange mix of relief and exhaustion. The day had been a whirlwind of revelations and confrontations, but I'd stood my ground. Staring at the empty desk where my PC once stood, I felt the weight of what I'd lost, not just the setup, but the trust and stability I'd thought I had in my life. Yet, for the first time in days, I also felt something else, a sense of clarity. The web of deceit Alyssa had spun was unraveling, and I was finally free of it. As the investigation unfolded, it became clear that Alyssa's betrayal ran far deeper than I could have ever imagined. The police's initial interest in Liam's extortion quickly expanded into something much larger. By the end of the first week, they uncovered a disturbing history of scams orchestrated by Alyssa herself. One of the officers called me with an update that left me reeling. Alyssa had been collecting fraudulent wedding expenses from her family for months. She had claimed we were planning an elaborate ceremony, complete with a destination venue, a live band, and designer decorations. In total, her family had handed over nearly $100,000 under these false pretenses. It was a staggering amount, and it painted a picture of just how deeply she'd manipulated everyone around her. The more they dug, the worse it got. Alyssa's social media profiles were filled with carefully curated posts showcasing a lifestyle that wasn't hers. Among the posts were pictures of my gaming setup, which she had used to advertise custom-built PCs for sale. She had lured in unsuspecting buyers with promises of high-end rigs, asking for deposits that ranged from $800 to $2,500. None of these people ever received a computer. The police connected with several victims, each one furious and eager to press charges. Knowing that my pride and joy had been turned into bait for a scam made me sick to my stomach. But the bombshell didn't end there. As the police expanded their investigation, they discovered Alyssa had opened multiple credit cards in Liam's name without his knowledge. She had maxed out each card, leaving him with over $25,000 in debt. Liam, who had initially been defensive and dismissive, was forced to confront the truth. When the officers showed him the evidence, he finally understood the full extent of his sister's deception. For the first time, Liam began cooperating with the investigation, sharing what little he knew about Alyssa's schemes. It was clear that Alyssa's manipulative tendencies weren't new. The police found evidence linking her to similar scams in the past. One particularly egregious case involved a previous boyfriend's car, which she had sold while he was out of town. The man had returned to find his car gone and Alyssa spinning a story about it being stolen. The pattern was undeniable. Alyssa had been exploiting people for years, using charm and lies to get what she wanted. As I processed all of this, I couldn't help but reflect on the red flags I'd ignored. There had always been little things, the way she'd dodge questions about her past, the inconsistencies in her stories, her tendency to shift blame whenever something went wrong. At the time, I'd chalked it up to quirks or misunderstandings. Now, I realized those moments were glimpses into the person she truly was. The turning point came when the police informed me that Alyssa's actions were being formally classified as fraud. Charges were being prepared, and it was only a matter of time before she would have to face the consequences of her actions. Knowing that justice was finally catching up to her brought a sense of closure I hadn't expected. The empty desk in my office still felt like a painful reminder of everything I'd lost, but it also stood as a testament to what I'd gained, the clarity to see through Alyssa's web of deceit and the strength to stand up for myself. The final chapter in this mess began with the news of Alyssa's arrest. It wasn't unexpected, the evidence against her had grown overwhelming, but hearing that the police had finally taken her into custody still felt surreal. She had been charged with fraud, theft, and identity theft. Reports indicated that she had tried to argue and charm her way out of it, but the officers were unmoved. The reality of her actions was finally catching up with her, and there was no escaping it this time. Her family's reaction was a complete 180. They'd been so quick to defend her before, bombarding me with accusations and guilt trips, but now, faced with undeniable evidence, their loyalty evaporated. The proof of her scams, the fake wedding expenses, the stolen money, the lies, was too much for even them to ignore. Her parents looked utterly defeated, her father muttering apologies to anyone who would listen. It was clear they'd been as much her victims as anyone else, manipulated and used for her own gain. Meanwhile, Liam's involvement took a surprising turn. Initially combative and dismissive, he had no choice but to confront the truth after the evidence against Alyssa became public. The stolen credit cards, the debts in his name, it was all laid bare. To his credit, he stepped up. For the first time, Liam showed genuine remorse, testifying against Alyssa in court. He detailed how she'd used him, how she'd convinced him to go along with her schemes, and how he'd been left to pick up the pieces. Liam's testimony marked a turning point, not just in the case but in his own life. He started working to rebuild his reputation, taking steps to repay the debts Alyssa had saddled him with. It wasn't easy, the damage she'd done was extensive, but he seemed determined to make amends. Watching him begin to take responsibility for his own life was a small but meaningful silver lining in an otherwise dark situation. The courtroom proceedings were intense. Alyssa, true to form, tried every trick in the book to deflect blame. She accused Liam of being complicit, painted me as a vindictive ex, and even tried to frame her family as overly demanding. None of it worked. The evidence was irrefutable, from the recorded calls to the financial documents and testimony from multiple victims. The judge's verdict was clear: restitution to all her victims, including her family, and an 18-month prison sentence. Alyssa's reaction in court was a mix of disbelief and desperation. As the reality of her sentence sank in, she turned to me with a last-ditch plea. She begged me to drop the charges, promising to repay everyone she'd scammed. But her words rang hollow. I'd already handed over everything to the authorities. The decision wasn't mine to make anymore, and even if it had been, I knew I couldn't trust her. Too much damage had been done, and her promises meant nothing now. When the trial ended, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Relief, certainly, justice had been served, and Alyssa's web of lies had finally collapsed. But there was also a lingering sadness, a sense of loss for the relationship I'd once believed in. The person I thought I'd loved had never truly existed, she'd been a facade, carefully constructed to manipulate and deceive. It was a bitter pill to swallow, but it also brought a sense of closure. The final piece of this saga came unexpectedly. Liam showed up at my door a few weeks later, looking sheepish but determined. Beside him were several large boxes, taped shut, and I immediately guessed they contained my gaming PC and its components, the tower, monitor, keyboard, and everything else. Seeing the setup back in its rightful place was a small but powerful victory, a symbol of reclaiming not just my property but a piece of my life that Alyssa had tried to steal. As I sat at my desk that evening, the familiar hum of the PC filling the room, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. The chaos Alyssa had brought into my life was finally over, and for the first time in months, I could breathe freely. The road ahead was still uncertain, but one thing was clear: I'd learned to trust my instincts, to stand up for myself, and to never again ignore the red flags that had led me down this path. The weeks following the trial marked a turning point, not just for me but for everyone Alyssa had affected. With the chaos behind me, I decided to channel my energy into something productive. The gaming community I had been a part of for years came through in an incredible way. Together, we organized a fundraiser to support the victims of Alyssa's scams. Gamers from across the city donated, not just money but time and equipment, showing solidarity in a way that reminded me why I'd fallen in love with this community in the first place. By the end of the campaign, we'd raised enough to cover partial restitution for several victims, a small but significant step toward justice. Liam, too, was on a path to recovery. After returning my PC components, he made it a point to stay in touch. He expressed deep regret for his role in Alyssa's schemes, admitting he'd been blind to her manipulations for far too long. It wasn't just words. Liam took actionable steps to repair his credit, working with financial advisors and even taking on a second job to chip away at the debt Alyssa had left him with. What stood out most was his newfound humility. He became an active ally in our efforts to support the scam victims, sharing his story to help others recognize and avoid similar pitfalls. Alyssa's family, humiliated and shaken, took a long, hard look at their own role in enabling her behavior. Her father, the man who had once threatened me on my doorstep, reached out with a heartfelt apology. He admitted that his blind loyalty to Alyssa had clouded his judgment and that he regretted the harm his actions had caused. While forgiveness didn't come easily, I respected the effort. The family's focus shifted to supporting Liam, distancing themselves from Alyssa's toxic influence. It was clear they were determined to rebuild and learn from their mistakes. For my part, the entire ordeal forced me to confront the red flags I had ignored. Looking back, there had been so many small lies, subtle manipulations, and moments that didn't quite add up. I'd brushed them aside, convincing myself they didn't matter. I'd told myself that everyone had flaws, that compromise was part of a relationship. But the truth was, I'd ignored my instincts, letting my desire for stability in companionship override the warning signs. The experience taught me the value of setting boundaries and trusting my gut. It's not about being paranoid or overly critical, it's about recognizing patterns and respecting your own worth. Alyssa had exploited my kindness and my willingness to give people the benefit of the doubt. Never again. Moving forward, I vowed to approach relationships with a clearer understanding of what I deserved and what I would no longer tolerate. As I settled back into a routine, the gaming PC became more than just a setup. It was a symbol of resilience, a reminder of what I had reclaimed. I'd lost a lot in the process, not just money and trust, but a version of myself that had been too willing to overlook the truth. But in its place, I'd gained something far more valuable: clarity, strength, and the ability to move forward. The final lesson came as I reflected on the nature of betrayal. It rarely starts with grand acts of deceit. More often, it's a series of small cracks, ignored warning signs, dismissed doubts, and compromises that chip away at trust. Alyssa's actions had been extreme, but the path to that destruction had been paved with smaller lies and manipulations. Recognizing those early signs is what I would carry with me into the future. Life isn't perfect, but it's mine again. And for that, I'm grateful. The road to rebuilding wasn't easy, but it was worth it. I'd come out stronger, with a deeper appreciation for trust, accountability, and the strength of a community that refused to let me face it alone.